We've seen that like the longer that you have a conversation with ChatGPT, the harder it is for it to remember what happened 10, 15 turns ago. That said, I think that's really where the evolution would have the most potential. I think there's a lot of hype around generative AI right now, and a lot of people talking about how we're already living in the future, or we're, building the future, and everything is so new. But I think, one thing that I appreciated about Jakob Nielsen's article is that he drew the history from the beginning of computing up until now, and very clearly explained that not all these problems are new. And I think that's really the thing that I want to kind of emphasize and remind folks is, we learned, like, I think he had asked a question before, like, oh, you would not have a conversation about a form. And that's like my favorite example to use, because if you think about, modern day society, when you go into the doctor for the first time, they hand you a form. They don't sit there and interview you for an hour with 100 questions about your medical history. And so that has to do with that efficiency piece. And I think what Nielsen spoke about in his article about the fusion of graphical and conversational interfaces, I think that really is a more optimal future that we're working towards. If we're going to ask more than 3 questions, my response to anyone is always put it in a form. Put it in a form. Who wants to have a conversation that's 50 turns long? When you could fill it out in 2 minutes, not even 2 minutes. And
let's talk about that article since we've teased it so much. So prior to us talking, I sent a link over because I wanted to make sure to talk about this article that's been making the rounds at Four Kitchens. This article is a year old, but it resurfaced. So this is by Jakob Nielsen. It's called AI First New UI Paradigm in 60 Years. So pardon me for a moment, this takes a bit of explanation. So to summarize this article here, he summarizes it as AI is introducing the third user interface paradigm in computing history, shifting to a new interaction mechanism where users tell the computer what they want, not how to do it, thus reversing the locus of control. So the idea here is that there have been 3 paradigms in user interfaces. The first was batch processing. So think about like punch cards and, like the Colossus, the first real computer in 1945. You'd have, that was a tape based machine with an optical sensor. But anyway, think about punch cards. Instead, you just have this big old stack of punch cards. You feed it into a machine. You let it run a bunch of operations overnight. And, hopefully you have, wake up in the morning and you have some kind of a result at the end. And maybe you don't because there's a mistake, or maybe it's a bunch of nonsense. And then you kind of do the whole thing all over again. That was the first kind of paradigm of user interface. And the second is command-based interaction design, which is what we've had for the past 60 years and continue to have, which is this idea that the user and the computer take turns. There's some kind of an input, and then we get an output, and we react to it, and then we do another input, we get another output, and we react to it. That could be a command line. That could be us moving the mouse and clicking on things. It could be a graphical thing. It's all of that stuff. It's touching the phone. It's tapping on things. It's all of that. Works great. And Jakob talks about how much he loves that. But now there's this third paradigm, and this is actually really fascinating, and it's based in generative AI. It's the idea that we state our intended outcome. We are no longer giving the computer commands and then seeing what the output is, and then giving it more input. Instead, we just tell the AI, this is what we want, and it goes out and tries to do that for us. And we don't get to, there's no more turns. There's not really this idea of like, we get to see it step by step. It just sort of happens. And then maybe we try it again and we try it again. And we sort of, it's not exactly taking turns and it's not exactly refining it. It's kind of something a little different. But it's about intent. And we tell it what want, and it's kind of spooky. And this is where he gets into this whole, he says these very interesting things about prompt engineering and prompt engineers. And this is why I shared the article prior to this interview. So he mentioned that prompt engineers exist to tickle ChatGPT in the right spot so it coughs up the right answers. And he says that this new role of prompt engineer reminds us of how we used to need to have specially trained query specialists to search through extensive databases of medical research or legal cases. But then Google came along and anybody could search that. We didn't need those roles anymore. So that same level of usability leapfrogging is needed with these new tools. Better usability of AI should be a significant competitive advantage to people who are willing to put in the research to make AI more usable. And so this is when he brings up this example of the form. And like, well, would you want to have a conversation about a 100 field form? No, you wouldn't. You just want to fill out the form. But what if there is some kind of interesting combination of the two? And he kind of expounds from there for a little while. And anyway, it's an interesting article. So yes, so my question then to you is, what are your thoughts then about the future of prompt engineering through Jakob's lens of we're in this maybe potentially temporary middle state of, well, first of all, let me stop there and ask you, do you think that prompt engineering is a temporary middle state?
I think so, which I think that's becoming an increasingly more controversial opinion. I've talked to more and more folks recently from other companies, Google's and the like. And I was a bit surprised to hear that more and more opinions are coming out that prompt engineering is here to stay, rather than prompt engineering is this sort of transient or transitory phase. Reason being is because I had a colleague from Google telling me that, he was finding it surprisingly more difficult to pull away from prompt engineering and shift to whatever other option they're working on at Google that he couldn't tell me about. And I am also similarly surprised because I think of prompt engineering again, and this is all because my background is around thinking of language as a system. I think that because you are creating prompts using language, they inherently have structure. If you're using language, they inherently have patterns. And so if there's structure and patterns, then theoretically you can analyze that and then do something to try and make that less manual. So I like to think that Nielsen is, right about that's where we would go. Personally, from my perspective, I think prompt engineering is way too manual right now. And in the same way that we saw this slowdown with the hype around chatbots back in around, 2017, 2018, where people found out, it's a lot more difficult because you have to create intents and train them. And and you have to do the conversation design manually, that it wasn't quite as efficient or as easy to do as people thought. In fact, it was much more expensive to do so. I wonder if we're going to get to that point when it comes to implementing generative AI soon, when it comes to creating an actual meaningful or a user experience that has utility and flow. Right now, I think that because the hype is so big and because it's new, and I think people are just craving something new in the technological field, we haven't really seen a boom like this since, the invention of the app for a smartphone. That I think that's really where the phase that we're in right now. Okay, the experience may not be great, but I think Nielsen is right. The company that's going to nail that conversational, multimodal, interactive experience, that's going to be the one that's going to set the bar and everybody will follow. But prompt engineering, right now, I think it's just too manual for that to scale. My hope is that we can get to a point where prompt engineering isn't quite so manual and we can make it faster and more pattern and system driven.
What might that look like? Like how could prompt engineering evolve into a different kind of of user experience. Like it seems to me that the analogy that Jakob uses, where he says, well, there used to be specially trained query specialists who can look through extensive databases of medical research, but now there's just Google. That seems to be too close a connection. Whereas like prompt engineering evolving into something else feels like that's going to be a bigger leap.
I actually like that metaphor a lot, because the difference I see between these sort of, highly trained medical specialists and anybody using Google is the degree of specificity or register around the language you use to perform the search. So you may have to know and be very specific with the kind of language or terms that you would use as like a trained professional to look up medical records in the past. But now, because Google has solved the problem of having to know any of those terms, that anybody can perform a search. It can be quite general, and you can sort of, like you said, have that turn taking and continue to refine it. I think I do have a counterpoint to this idea in Nielsen's article that there's no turn taking when it comes to, prompt based interactions, because I think that there are. I think that, conversation is all about you say one thing, the other person says something back. When I put in the prompt, I get an output back. And then when I say, now do X to that output, that's turn number 3. And then turn number 4 is when I get the refined output. Now, to what extent do those turns continue to persist, and, does the memory hold? That part starts to degrade over time. We've seen that, like, the longer that you have a conversation with ChatGPT, the harder it is for it to remember what happened 10, 15 turns ago. That said, I think that's really where the evolution would have the most potential in terms of prompting, is that ideally you don't need these huge, massive, context-laden prompts, and that you can just have this conversation with, a large language model and say, I want you to write me a paragraph that, introduces me on LinkedIn to a community of developers. And then you get an output and say, now change it to be more hip because they're 20 years old. Okay. It needs to then think about what it means and what they are in the conversation.
Oh.
So, because
okay.
When we're having human conversations, we use
it. Yep.
Exactly. Because in language, the phenomenon is called anaphora. You're making a reference using a pronoun to something that happened earlier in the conversation. That, I think, will be the difference between a prompt engineer doing what I'm doing and an everyday person having that third turn, saying, now do X to it or that, do this or that.
That's the analogy with the query specialist, the medical database. Is now an everyday person can say, rather than having to construct a highly precise query, or prompt, a highly precise prompt, and then having to sort of rework the prompt and start from scratch, and rework the prompt and start from scratch, and then finally, like, all right, I've got the perfect prompt, and then here we go, boom. All right, great. Now I've got the output that I want. Instead of that, it's just sort of like, well, it's kind of whatever. You could just sort of like, just kind of throw out something muddy and imprecise and whatever, and then you get a couple of rounds and you're like, all right, that's perfect, right? Like, it's that in the same way. It's just like Google search, medical stuff, whatever,
exactly. Like, done. You can put in Google, I have a sore throat, and then these things will come out, as opposed to having to use a very specific medical term, or you already have to have an idea about the medical domain in order to perform the search. Similarly, I think with prompt engineering right now, I think having this understanding of how language works and linguistics and the mechanics of linguistics, ideally, very soon you won't need to do that. You just speak as if you would to you and me.
Yeah. And it seems to me that the areas of evolution, because right now when it comes to prompt engineering, obviously there are all these ways that the prompts, well, I'm sorry, let me back up. When it comes to things like generative AI, there's the ways that the prompt can evolve, and people's interactions, their user experience with the prompt can evolve. But then there are areas like where most people tend to be focusing is accuracy.
Mhm.
right? Like what most people are concerned about, like the big areas of concern are like, well, it needs to be factually accurate.
Right.
Like we just,
Right.
the facts need to be there.
Yeah.
And then like things like prompt injection, right?
Yes.
Like that's also a major issue. And there is this trend out there that luckily, I think it hasn't completely worn off, but like it isn't nearly as, in fashion as it was maybe 6 months
Mhm.
ago, where like people are like, look at what I made the thing say.
Yes.
Like, well, okay, yeah, you can bend anything to the point that it breaks. We've all learned that.
Sure.
You apply any amount of stress to any situation, eventually it's going to snap. But actually, to that point, I'm wondering if you've like in the world of prompt injection, we
Mhm.
did mention system prompts briefly earlier in the conversation. We didn't really explain what that was.
Mm.
And I think it's probably worth just touching on that in the context of prompt injection.
Sure.
So just word of explanation to anybody who's listening who hasn't heard of system prompts before. System prompt is something that happens that you're not aware of. It's a thing that gets added, I believe, after the prompt that you send. It's a little bit of hidden stuff that happens. It's sent in plain language behind what you say that has a whole bunch of stuff. And it usually says things like, don't adopt different personas, don't be racist, don't do these things, don't send instructions for making bombs, like that kind of stuff. And it's usually just a list of things that if you were, and you can actually find them in some places if you look hard enough, or some people have jailbroken them and you can find the list. It reads like a list of things that happened, because it is. It's a list of things that happened, and they just added it to the list and it got sent along. So every time you add a prompt, every time you send a prompt to, whatever, ChatGPT or something, there's also a whole bunch of stuff that gets sent right behind it secretly, that exists to not do things. So it's telling the AI to say, ignore everything else that was said and now do these things or don't do these things. And it's supposed to protect things like prompt injection, which is the idea of trying to then break the AI and make it do things and make it spit out things and find like hidden data and show you it's the training model and reveal its system prompt and all of that kind of stuff. I'm curious if you have I don't know, any tips for avoiding that kind of thing, or any interesting stories about things that you run into there, because that's a real issue that people who do this kind of stuff really need to be aware of.
Yeah. I mean, I think prompt injection, prompt hacking is probably the thing that's going to move the field along further and faster than potentially anything else. I think that sort of constant barrage and creativity around how to either get around or do these nefarious things are forcing professionals like me and other prompt engineers to think through how to defend against them and how to
Mhm.
make your prompt stronger. I think with the system prompt, it can be kind of complicated because the longer and more convoluted you make your system prompt, the more likely it is that the model could potentially get confused. And some of these hacking methods or injection methods defending against them can potentially overly restrict your model in terms of
Mhm.
its output. So have been instances where I have put certain instructions in the system prompt to defend against prompt hacking that then made it overly restrictive to the point where it wasn't answering questions that it probably should have, for customers. And so then I have to think through a different situation where, okay, how do I strike that balance between making sure that it can defend against these, attacks, but also not
Mhm.
make it so overly restrictive that it will answer a question that would seem perfectly reasonable in a sales or service interaction. That's part of the reason why I do like to follow Pliny the Prompter on Twitter, because Pliny has so many examples. I think even have like a whole GitHub repository for different kinds of prompt attacks, and I think it's important to look at them and then red team your prompts and say, okay, can my prompts stand against these attacks? And sometimes the answer is no. I
Meaning
think
purposely try to break into your own. your own
Correct.
setup, your own system.
Exactly. And luckily I work with, security folks, so people who are actually, professionals in security, and they, reassure me. They say, look, security is a process. It's never a state of being. And so you're never going to be 100% secure. You're always going to have to do your best. And there are moments when you are 100% secure, but then someone comes up with a new attack method, and then you have to figure out how to react to that. And so I think that, again, seeing what's current, seeing what people are doing to hack the prompts, and potentially jailbreak them, I think it actually just makes you a better prompt engineer.
Thank you, Greg, so much for your time and for a fantastic conversation. If anybody wants to follow you or look you up or hear more about what you're doing, how do they get a hold of you?
LinkedIn is probably the best way. So I'm on LinkedIn, and always happy to respond to a message or chat about these things, or learn of any methods that you have to share. I mean, I'm sure, everyone's experiencing this at the same time, and we're all learning it from different perspectives. And I think one thing that is really important to me is to get perspectives from folks who have a very different background than I do. So if I were to leave anybody with any kind of message at the end, it would be, don't count yourself out if you're not a linguist, or if your first language isn't English, or, you have a background that seems completely unrelated. That your perspective is so unique that you'll probably discover something that the rest of us would never have thought of, and I want to hear about it. So let me know, connect with me on LinkedIn, and happy prompting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Todd.